Before I introduce our next panel in front of you, I'd just like to remind all of you to please make sure that before you leave, you do submit the feedback forms that each one of you got. You can submit them at the registration desk, or you can let them be at your tables, and we'll make sure that our team collects them. And of course, all those of you who are active on Twitter, you're most welcome to hashtag #ETEdge. Once again, I'd like to thank each one of our partners. Let's put our hands together for our partners, our title partners, SREI, our technology partners, IBM, our platinum partners, Mega Ferry, our transmission partners, Bajaj Electricals, our silver partners, NIIT, our project logistics partners, Sarfred. I'd also like to thank our supply chain partners, Leeladhar Fasu, our knowledge partners, UL, our SEZ partners, MSEZ, and of course, I'd also like to thank our associate partners, magazine partners, and live webcast partners. Let me also take this opportunity to request each one of you at the back end of the hall to please move slightly up ahead, and I can promise you that this is going to be a very interactive session. So may I request all those of you at the last few round tables to please take the first few seats. I'm sure our speakers too will appreciate an interactive session. So may I request all those of you at the back end of the hall to please join us a little up ahead in the ballroom. Gentlemen at the back end of the hall, please. May I request everyone at the back end of the hall to please take the first few seats. Post this session, we'll gladly welcome all of you for a networking tea and coffee break. But for now, we bring to you our final panel discussion of the day, from drawing room board to execution, bringing vision to reality through PPP. Let us put our hands together and welcome on stage our moderator for the session, Mr. Suneet Maheshwari, Group EVP, L&T Financial Holdings. Let's put our hands together as he joins us on stage. Just a couple of more minutes for... Sir, please. I know we are coming closer to heading up into a weekend, but let's really show all our energies as I welcome on stage our panelists. Let's put our hands together and welcome Mr. Rajiv Banga once again. He was our earlier speaker as well. We have with us Mr. Parrott, Minister, Counsellor and Senior Trade Commissioner, Canadian High Commission. Thank you for joining us, sir. We also have with us Mr. Vinayak, Chatterjee, Chairman, Feedback Infra. Once again joining us as a part of a panelist this time. I'd like to welcome on stage Mr. Benedict, LJ Edinburgh, Program Leader, Economic Integration India, World Bank. Thank you for joining us. On the panel, Mr. Ajay Gupta, Head Infrastructure Finance, HDFC Bank. Let's put our hands together and welcome Mr. Arun, Lakhani, CMD, Vishvaraj Infrastructure. We have with us Dr. R. Mandal, Advisor, SREI Infrastructure Finance. And once again, after the session and few minutes from each one of the panelists, we'd like to open the house for questions and suggestions. May I now request the moderator to please take the lead, sir?
So, this is the last session of the day, so that's a bit of a challenge, but I hope we can make that interesting for you. We have a very impressive list of our group of panelists here. Is there a mic, a hand mic that you're going to give, or a lapel mic? I think there's a lot of discussion and on infrastructure, etc., but I think the areas that we probably today want to debate on is this whole gamut of issues around PPP. So one of the thoughts I have is I would lob the ball to each one of our panelists and cover a variety of issues from their own set of experiences around PPP that is happening, and also, the perspective of other international experiences that are relevant, or other sectoral experiences in the context of it. One of the perspectives today, which when we talk about PPPs, how do you, in a life of a 25-year-old project or a 30-year-old concession, it is inconceivable that there won't be some black swan event which would need deliberation and discussion. No legal contract can really envisage events 5, 10, 15 years down the line, which we cannot visualize. So I think the whole need to revisit and renegotiate contracts is something that we are all plagued with today in terms of how do we go about. Is this something unique, or is it something unique happening in India which shouldn't be happening? And I would that should be an area that we could cover. The other is, and there are a whole variety of therefore force majeure situations under which again renegotiation of contracts need to be looked at. A dispute resolution mechanism, I think those are some of the things that have been found challenging. We found that also in some of these contexts where there is direct people interface, how people have been interfaced with, does the project allow for that or not, or do people do that or not? And some of the international lessons, and also what are the international investors looking at? And I think these are some of the loose list of issues that we would like to gather with. And may I request, starting from my right, Dr. Mandal, if you could be the opening batsman and start with your 3 minutes.
It's a big challenge, Suneet. It's a lot of challenge now before the PPP activities that to be carried forward. Well, you have seen that since the new government came into power, a lot of declaration has been made. They are also intending to go for a trajectory of growth at the rate of 2 digits soon, 2-3 years, and that needs to be sustained if they really want to bring the inclusive growth into practice. Almost 35 to 40 crores people still living below poverty line. They've got a serious responsibility to do that. So to achieve that kind of a growth, you need obviously huge resources to be mobilized, and with the commitment of the social sectors from the government, they won't have any surpluses really to create that kind of an infrastructure that we need. So it is the private sector who we have to depend upon. At the same time, the PPP projects in that private sectors have been undertaking over the past 10-15 years have been facing serious challenges now. So one has to now decide as to continue with the PPP projects or throw them out and go for the EPC projects altogether. The government cannot really afford to go for that. So PPP has to be really carried forward. So my suggestion will be that PPP we can't really abandon at this stage. We must take PPP as a serious challenge, and through the lessons that we have learned in the past 10-15 years of operation, we try to overcome the difficulties that we have faced. We try to internationalize it in such a way that not only the domestic investors get more confidence and risk averting approach, but the international investors could also be attracted to the PPP projects, so that this in the infrastructure sectors it can take off in a faster manner, so that other investment in the industry and manufacturing sectors can follow. Without infrastructure, investing in the manufacturing or any other sectors will be really not effective enough. So this is my view, that PPP must be encouraged, and we must address all the challenges that we have faced through the experience that we gained in the past 10-15 years. I think I'll continue with that and share the opinion later as it comes.
Would you like to do something, Mr. Arun?
Yeah, I will continue the.
I think you have also some perspectives with respect to social sectors, so maybe you would like to highlight that.
Yeah, I think PPP, as we know, is a good model for private efficiency, moderated by the public reasonableness for the profits. Particularly in the social sectors, what we feel is that like in water or wastewater sectors, we need to do more onboarding of the fourth P, the people. See, the problem today in PPPs are also from the structural issues, and rightly like said, no one can envisage 30 years at a go at any beginning of the contract. However, the type of trust deficit that has emerged in the last few years in the PPP sector, only onboarding of people and, like communication with them on a stronger note can take place. I will talk about the water sector, where you see that it's a very sensitive sector. It's not like any other PPP. However, the need there is immense, because when we talk of drinking water, we are talking of 50% plus non-revenue water. That translates into almost 20,000 million liter per day of water. Even if we say 50% of that, we are talking of, $1 billion plus saving, which will be transferred to the citizens. So they get the same type of water, paying less. If you go to the sewage side, the situation is much worse. We are almost having 38,000 million liter of sewage we produce in urban centers. We have only 30% installed capacity, which runs at say 50%. Now, these type of problems, if we only go by EPC, the accountability, where will it come? Now, out of this 30,000, if we can only treat and reuse 10,000, I mean, we must treat all, but if we can reuse 10,000 MLD, we are talking of creating fresh water resource of 10,000 MLD for the towns. I think, these type of social subjects also need to be addressed by PPP, because you see, investing into EPC and facility is easy, but maintaining it and being accountable to maintain it on a longer run, PPP can probably is a better way. So having these multiple bottom lines, we need more buy-in from the fourth P, the public. If we can achieve that, I'm sure this model, which appears to be, there is a debate whether we should go for it or go for the EPC model, but the inherent benefit of this model of long-term O&M commitment should not be lost. That's what I feel.
Ajay, coming to you, I think let's have a banker's perspective, because we have long concessions and a whole lot of this debate that is currently continuing. Would you like to present some of those perspectives there?
Before just coming to that point, just would like to share a story with you that I began my career as a civil servant, and the first country I visited after joining, I got a chance to go to Singapore, and oh boy, I saw the infrastructure there. I'm talking about 95, and then there was this rush of flood. Why can't we have something similar in India? Was a question that came to my mind, and since then I've been a passionate infrastructure professional, and so the question starts from why can't we have this infrastructure, this restoration, and then now after spending so many years, I realize the complexities. So from government I moved over to financing project and structure finance. So there in US and in India, and then finally here. So what Suneet just touched upon, a very important point, is about bankability of this project. I think so. All this time I was wondering, what is it that a banker can do to improve? What can a banker contribute to a infrastructure space? I have a lot of respect for entrepreneurs there's a lot of sweat and blood and hard work and sometimes human sacrifice that goes into building a project. At times, whenever I go to a plant site, one of my questions is, has anybody lost life? Invariably, at least 4 to 5 people have lost their life in building a large project. So that's the amount of effort and sacrifice that goes into building a project, and here are bankers like us who sometimes have to say no to certain projects. I think I've reconciled in my head that it's okay to say no to some projects, because not all projects should be financed and not all projects are bankable. At some level it is very complex to underwrite or appraise this project, but in many ways it is sheer common sense. It requires hard work. If there is a thermal power project and you are looking at coal logistics, and if the coal has to move from a mine to a port and then through a ship to another port and then to another site, and if you get into the details, it's sheer common sense that can help you underwrite these projects and understand the weaknesses and address them, mitigate them. One of the simple things, that we sometimes as bankers, I'm talking in general, rely upon is, who's funding this project? Okay, this group, okay, they will pay back the money, they have never lost the money. But somewhere, I think we're forgetting that project finance means that you have to get the money out of the project through the cash flows of the project. So that's where I think there have been instances where projects, banking system has said no to those projects. In roads it has happened, in ports it has happened. And what happened after that is people got back to the drawing board and said, okay, either change the scope of the project or they improved the bankability, and then these projects came back to the market. So as bankers, I think we need to have courage to say no to certain projects, and that will help build a servo mechanism where, some correction will happen. And you will get, the asset quality will start improving over time.
I think that was interesting. Bankers' capability to say no. But I think a whole lot of people are also saying, we will come back to that when we come to question and answers. But one of the thoughts, Ajay, I'd like to talk about is that once you've done the project and then there are certain black swan events come in, and we have seen some of these happen in the Indian economy today and in the recent past. What are the challenges and what are your thoughts on that? We'll come back to that. Okay, so I thought, that's something that is probably bothering everybody in the system. On the same issue, Benedict, I think what we would like to have is, the bank's worldview on what this whole issue of renegotiation and relook at projects and PPP, and the bank has a lot of rich experience around the thing. If you could put on some points which could be useful for our audience.
Yeah, I think the main point here is in India, don't be discouraged. These things happen in life. So in other countries like Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, and even in a country like France, a few decades ago, it happened as well. So we're not talking about something that is completely new for the world. Situations can change, so and currency can depreciate rapidly. So you're in a new situation. So like in Mexico a decade ago, 2 decades ago, and Brazil, the same situation. So there are experiences across the world that can be taken into account, and one of them is don't take half measures. If you take half measures, the situation can even get worse, and then you have to solve later on and come up with bigger solutions. And not sure you want to go there to those bigger solutions, and because that means, for instance, in France, they renationalized or they nationalized the PPP program, and 10 years later they brought it back to the private sector. These are very tough measures. But it's important to keep it in mind that experiences are there, you can learn lessons from that, but you have to be very much on top of it. Renegotiation is not a sin, it is something you can do, but it has to follow a certain transparent process. And then there is nothing wrong with it, but you have to guarantee a process that would lead to more transparency and to results. Last point I want to make, those countries like Brazil and Mexico, it took them 10 years to get out of this. I don't think India can afford 10 years to get out of it. We would call it the lost decade in that sense. And that is really bad. That cannot happen.
Yes.
India cannot afford that. We need to go back to almost 9 or 10% growth to address poverty in India. And economic growth is critical for that. So I encourage everybody to really look into this very carefully before we lose many years. Infrastructure is needed. Infrastructure is needed for growth. If you don't have growth, people will stay in poverty, and that is really bad. And we will all have this responsibility together to address that.
Thanks a lot. I think, Benedict, that's giving everybody a perspective that this has happened elsewhere and that this is not happening first time here. It's a very interesting, it's a refreshing perspective, and does tell you that there are experiences around the world from which we can learn, not just our own. Vinayak, over to you now, saying you've been at the forefront with various chambers of commerce, CII, and with the government, and in terms of advocacy and talking some of the points. If you could try and encapsulate some of the issues that we've talked about, and what kind of transpired between, let's say, the industry and the government, it would be interesting for all of us to know.
Thank you, Suneet. I think, sitting in 2014, I was asking myself, when did the PPP movement really start in India? And I suppose there are different points of views on that. At one level, it was maybe ILFS's first small Rao Pitampur road, which may have been the first PPP project, I don't know. Or it could have been 1992, the first few fast-track power plants in Andhra Pradesh, Spectrum, GVK, 92. You participated in the telecom PPPs, 93, 94. 1997 was when IDFC was set up and NHAI was set up, so maybe 1997 is a good enough benchmark. But whichever way you look at it, I think we've got more than 2 decades of PPP experience behind us to reflect on some of the points that my co-panelists have raised. And I will tell you the journey, and I will call it a journey because both for the government, the private sector, and here I mean the developers, and the third leg of the stool, the financing community, domestic and international, many lessons have been learned. Very hard lessons have been learned. And let me encapsulate them in 4 buckets, all of which start with R. So the 4 R's of key learnings. First, risk allocation. Second, renegotiation. Third, regulation. And fourth, rational bidding. Very quickly on each of these, on risk allocation, it is now reasonably common knowledge that it has been extremely skewed in favor of the sovereign, which is the government, risk minimizing itself at the cost of the private sector. And I'll give you one example of this. 3 days back, at a fairly senior level meeting at CII in Mumbai, Mr. Nitin Gadkari addressed us, and since it was a public, it was open to public, the press was there, I have no hesitation in sharing with you, that today's Minister of Road Transport said at this public meeting that on analysis of the failure of road projects, he has personally come to the conclusion that 95% of the reasons were because of government not meeting its obligation. I don't need any more evidence to offer before you in terms of how risk allocation was completely mismatched. Number 2, renegotiation. Benedict has already spoken about it. In PPPs where you have contracts going as high as 60 years, like Delhi Airport, 30 plus 30, it is impossible for the best legal mind in the country to predict every black swan event that may come. So by definition, a PPP is an incomplete contract, and if you buy the logic, which very senior legal people like Zia Modi, Shardul Shroff have often explained to the government on behalf of industry, that a PPP contract is by definition an incomplete document, the next point logically follows that if that is so, then renegotiation is a natural process. But as Benedict and all of us have said, there has to be an instituted process for renegotiation, which is credible, transparent, and fair. Set it up. That's what we've told the government. On regulation, it is very important that if you want serious sustainable PPP, you require level playing fields, which in one stroke means independent regulation. You have to put the horse before the cart. Otherwise, you'll end up in the kind of mess. You will move from one ad hoc solution to another ad hoc solution to another ad hoc crisis. We need independent regulation in those sectors where PPP is expected to come in a big way. And finally, rational bidding. Rational bidding, at the root of it is bad behavior by the private sector. You can call it greed, you can call it irrational exuberance. At the same time, if you know that irrational bidding happens, and it happens all over the world, then the government must also have a system where it eliminates outlier bids. So that system has to be put in place. We can't blame the fact that there will be some irrational bids in any system. Even if you sit at playing cards at Diwali, there will be some people at the table who will make irrational bids. So if you know that that happens, then you set up systems that eliminate outlier bids. So I can go on, but I'm saying here are the 4 areas where private sector has engaged in serious discussion with the government. The 4 R's, risk allocation, renegotiation, independent regulation, and rational bidding. And we have appealed to the government to actually put in a huge amount of intellectual effort behind recasting the PPP frameworks. I hope, as Benedict has scared us, I hope India doesn't have a lost decade. And one of the reasons I hope we will not have a lost decade of PPP is because at the last budget, the Union Minister has announced a new institution called 3P India. The 3P is obviously PPP. And very, very interestingly, he's allocated a whopping sum of 500 crores to create this institution. We understand that it is going to be an institution that is going to be set up and run by a combination of public and private intellectual capacity pooled into this institution. We hope 3P India will address these serious issues and that we will not have a lost decade, but maybe just a loss of 1 or 2 years till the whole mechanism is reset. That's it.
Thanks, Vinayak. I think giving that perspective of the debate that's been happening between industry and the government. I'm tempted to ask, but I'll come back with the question later on. I'm sure so is our audience. Brian, I think coming back to you, is there anything, I mean, there's a whole lot of debate that you have heard here, but in this context, is there anything that you would like to bring two perspectives? I thought one is, are there any Canadian lessons or messages that you think are relevant for us to consider? And in your course, have you come across some international investor perspectives that I understand some of the Canadian pension funds have been pretty actively looking at India, and if you have come across some issues that are top of their mind, it might be useful for us to hear that.
Sure. Thanks, Suneet. Well, having been in India all of 3 weeks now, I don't think I can really comment on the Indian situation. So I thought I'd just talk a little bit about the Canadian experience and perhaps answer some of those questions. PPPs in Canada were really thrust on us by an infrastructure deficit and fiscal reality, which is the case in every country. But there's really a robust private sector in Canada, which, so what I'm really talking about are public infrastructure projects, roads, hospitals, some of the social infrastructure that was mentioned before. To facilitate this, Canada created an organization, surprisingly enough, called PPP Canada. It's a federal government organization established by the federal government, but it's an independent body. It has an independent board of governors. It reports through Parliament, through the Minister of Finance, not the Minister of Construction or Transportation. So it's a financial instrument. They're put in place, and there's actually now, in our case, we call them provinces, in the case of India, states, but there's 5 other organizations such as this in 5 of the 10 provinces. Their role is really to ensure that projects are reviewed and are looked at to see if they, first of all, are amenable to a PPP structure, and then they bring expertise and they do a value analysis of that project to ensure that the benefits will exceed the costs. All of this, however, was, and there's enabling legislation that's put in place, but picking up on Vinayak's buckets, all of this was predicated on sort of five issues that went forward. First, there had to be political will, and this was extremely important in Canada. Politicians had to give up the notion that they were going to own and control the infrastructure project. So there was a political will that was required, and that political will required to accept that the private sector could leverage its skills. The second thing was it required broad public support. In Canada, this meant we had to get unions on side. Unions needed to understand that PPP projects were not necessarily going to take their jobs, but in fact were going to add to their pension. I can come back to that. Third, the private sector had to be brought on side, as I said, in order to leverage their skills. They had to understand that the process of bidding was going to be transparent, clear, and expeditious, and that was a really important point. The fourth thing that was a precursor to all of this was having a strong financial market. The bond market in North America is amenable to PPPs, and that was a very important point. And finally, the fifth point, governments had to accept that this was going to be a less prescriptive approach. So the objective was established, the outcome was set, and the private sector was then left to carry on that project, accepting the risks that went with it. So it's very much a PPP, a public-private partnership in Canada. There's now many projects that are going forward, and most of them are coming under budget, on time, etc., and we can go through all kinds of those lists. In terms of the financing, pension funds tend to look for opportunities. They're not necessarily going to invest in greenfield projects, They like to see a project that's up, the construction risk is gone, and they'll tend to invest in projects that have a long-term rate of return. That's perhaps in some of these renegotiations that are perhaps going on in India that Canadian pension funds could play a role.
Thanks, Brian, having that perspective. I'll come back to a particular question about Canada a little later, which is concerning its federal structure, which is very similar to that of India, and how some of those challenges probably Canada handled. Rajiv, you've been a developer, and we heard your presentation just some time back, and you've heard the kind of debate that we have had now and earlier. I think in the context of the fact that you were actually in the thick of things, what are your reactions to some of the issues that you have raised? And if so, how did you face some of the challenges? I think it might be interesting to
a couple of points which have come up in the course of the discussions as we've gone around the panel. I think it's very interesting, and this is something which we need to deal with most of the time, is that, it's very easy to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because there are issues with PPP, let's dump PPP and go to EPC. Pray, where's the money going to come from? People look at only the darker side of things. I think what people are forgetting is that when you entrust the task to a PPP, you're giving away a lot of equity risk and burdening them with making it happen. And I think that is a challenge which we face all the time. Let me illustrate. When we, we've heard about smart cities all day, so I'd like to take the liberty, some poetic license, and call ourselves a smart industrial zone. And in doing so, when we benchmark with other facilities all over the world, like Singapore and Saudi and Belgium and so on and so forth, what comes out is that industrial parks of this nature must have centralized utilities, CETPs, and everything at the doorstep, LNG lines, and so on and so forth. Now, if you're going to do that upfront, who's going to pay for it? Is there enough demand? Where's the money going to come from if it takes 5 years to incubate? And I think that is where this whole debate of EPC versus PPP gets answered. Because if the developer or the promoter is actually putting the money upfront, he is taking on the entire risk of populating the facility and getting the usership in time. Looking at it from the side where I have been, where I've gone through the thick of execution, I think that is a far greater risk for the entity than is ever perceived or given credit for. And so, for me, the easiest thing to say is, I hope there is a funding entity who will allow me to do it on EPC. I'll be delighted to do that, but the boot is on the other leg. And I think that is what I'd like to place on the table as something to provoke people that, okay, roads and ports to some extent may be far better fleshed out, and PPP models may be here to stay. But can you say the same for healthcare? Can you say the same for education? Can you say the same for infrastructure? Is nine blind men trying to describe an elephant? So it has wide ramifications. What is fleshed out, you can talk about EPC versus PPP very easily. But when it gets into the gray areas, I think you're much better off leaving the equity risk and making it happen to the developer in whatever format it is, and not go through the EPC way.
On that heartening note, I think you give a vote of confidence for PPP at a time when most people are in India talking about EPC. I think that's an interesting perspective. Given as a developer, I'm sure you have gone through and maybe still going through some of your own travails. Maybe I come back to my questions in reverse order. Brian, the question I had is, Canada also has a federal structure, and one of the complexities we have in India is a similar kind of a federal structure, and then in the Constitution you have schedules, Schedule 1, Schedule 2, which is the union list, the state list, and the concurrent list. And that poses a lot of challenges in terms of how you want to do things and don't. What has been the Canadian experience with respect to some of these things?
Well, it really depends on the constitutional structure. So in provinces are responsible for highways that are within their own boundaries. If there's a road that crosses boundaries, then it becomes a federal construct, and it's in that case that the federal government will impose its will, it's not its will, but it will impose its own regulations and processes. Fortunately, our provinces are all quite large, and so most of the road projects, most of the hospital projects, most of the social infrastructure that's done is the purview of the province. So British Columbia, Ontario, Quebec all have similar structures to PPP Canada, and those projects have been carried out, as I said, with legislation in place where they're required to assess the project and ensure that it meets PPP criteria. The federal government does that for federal projects, which are generally public infrastructure, which is, again, roads, power lines that they're crossing, transborders, and things like that. But as I said at the outset as well, in Canada, pipelines that are crossing borders to move oil to the coasts or natural gas to the coasts are private sector projects. So those are just done through a typical private sector financing model.
Great. I think, Vinayak, one of the questions that might be in the minds of a lot of people, and if I can preempt that, which is, in the discussions that you've been having from the industry with the government, what's your sense of hope?
See, the sense of positivism, which I suppose is the foundation for hope,
yes,
is very much in the air.
Okay.
However, there is certainly the practical realization that PPP structures need significant resetting before we can expect the next wave of PPP to happen. And that doesn't, and resetting many of these mechanisms or institutions or mechanisms is not going to be happening in a hurry because the processes are complicated. And therefore, I think a certain portion, in terms of political assessment of how we're going to handle the short term, the medium term, and the long term, I would like to state a personal position, which I think the government has done the right thing, that in the short term, it has taken a call on EPC, saying in the next 2 to 3 years, let's push 10,000 kilometers of roads, let's reset many of our cities in terms of their urban infrastructure projects, let's get cheap financing from Japan, China, Canada, wherever it is, cheap or non-cheap, and push existing and futuristic railway projects. So the belief is certainly that in the next 2 to 3 years, the entire infrastructure cycle needs to be rejuvenated, reset, confidence brought back to construction companies, developers, liquidity in the system so that the banking and the financing system see cash flows coming that can return their loans. So there's certainly an EPC mindset in the short term, but the very fact that the finance minister at the union budget sought to allocate 500 crores and create this new institution called 3P India, and that across speeches of the current set of politicians from top to the different layers, everybody is talking PPP. Even Ganga cleaning, the Prime Minister has said, will be affected by PPP. Many of the other projects you will find even in the Prime Minister's speeches, he refers to PPP. So there is a complete realization that PPP is the way to go forward. There's a lot of things that have gone wrong, and to reset institutions might take us 2-3 years. And in the interim, let's not lose steam, let's do EPC. So to give a straight answer to your straight question, there is great hope.
Great. Ajay, I wanted to ask you one question. You've heard a whole lot of debate we've had now and earlier. In the realm that we are today, and I'm going to ask you a very lead question, pardon my asking you here, sir, is do you think banks like yourselves, other banks, today are encouraged to increase their exposure to infrastructure? And if there is a yes, that's fine, but if you have some caveats, then I think we might like to understand.
See, I'd like to, it's a very interesting question, by the way, and thanks for asking it. I think unless banks play a pivotal role, I don't see infrastructure developing in this country. So there's no doubt banks are encouraged from every corner to do infra, and even so the fundamental question here is that as a bank, the money that we have is a money that belongs to depositors. So it's our fiduciary responsibility to make sure that our purpose is not only to, we are not set up just to give money, you also have to collect money. Right? So when you're talking about infrastructure projects, you are talking about 15 years, now even 20, 25 years. So obviously there are asset liability mismatches. So banks are not designed to lend 15, 20, 25 years. So effectively, but what banks bring to the table is ability to appraise the projects, underwrite them, package them. Then ultimately these projects have to go into the bond market, into investors, that happens globally, and that bond market in India is still evolving. So leaving those issues aside, coming specifically to whether we encourage, absolutely. But we are encouraged to do bankable projects and not projects where you don't know where coal is going to come from. So that's some of the things that have happened. The bankers, I'm not saying everybody, but in certain situations we have forgotten to read our lenders' independent engineer reports. We've forgotten to do a scoping for those reports. As I was mentioning earlier, at some level it is very basic common sense. If you do our hard work and if we do our groundwork right, then not every project will be bankable. The good projects will get financed, the bad ones will be weeded out, and they will go back to the drawing board and come back. So that servo mechanism, as I was mentioning, needs to work so that asset quality improves, the confidence gets reposed, and the infrastructure develops. The model ultimately has to be sustainable, not a one-off project financing that goes off.
I think with this, I get a message that we're coming toward the end. I'd like to take a couple of questions from the audience if there is. Please announce yourself, your name and the organization, and then please go ahead and ask. I can see a hand there.
Yeah, I'm Vivek Singh from Tata Consulting Engineers. See, there is one sector which is untouched by PPP, which is the rail sector. And in fact, rail sector, you saw PPP in the 19th century. Because if you look at Indian railways, nearly 40,000 route kilometers is actually PPP in the 19th century. So it was a very successful model. And the question to the panel is how to basically have PPP in the rail sector.
Vinayak, have you? Well, at least from the CII, you've been exposed to most of the. And Brian can also come in.
In the railway system, broadly, there are certain specific initiatives where PPP can work. For example, you are aware that there is a tender out for 800 diesel and 1,000 electric locomotives. This is the 5th time it is going for retendering. Forget that for the minute. But the fact is that there is a PPP structure in place for locomotive manufacture and O&M. It's a PPP format. There are baskets which are ready for station redevelopment, which is real estate based. New Delhi railway station was almost there, and different railway ministers have announced 15, 20 other railway stations where, based on the real estate value, PPP methods will be used for real estate. That's option number 2. Option number 3 is PPP contracts for moving goods and passengers. So far as many of the tourist trains are concerned, you know that there are some routes operating in South India and Jaipur, Palace on Wheels types, which are in PPP mode. There is also 14 licenses which have not worked very well, and for moving containers, there are 14 licenses for container trains. So movement of goods and passengers is amenable to PPPization. And finally, new tracks. There are a lot of new tracks which are being developed between between port and a coal mine, port and a cement plant and the main line. So there are different sizes of tracks, 20 kilometers, 28 kilometers, and they're across the country where Indian corporates and foreigners have invested in short lengths, and I'm saying about 20 to 30 kilometers of specific freight-related railway lines in PPP. So to answer your question, these possibilities exist. I do not think in mainline railway operations the mindset exists with the bureaucracy or with the unions to privatize, Mughal Sarai operations, for example. But these buckets of possibilities not only exist, They have been investigated, and in many cases they have been put up to the market, and in some cases they are operating.
You have a point?
I'll use an English example where right now there's a debate going on in the UK. I've come here from London, so I spent 4 years in the UK, talking about HS2 between London and Birmingham and further north. And that will be developed under a PPP model. The other case is High Speed 1, which is the rail line to the Channel from St. Pancras Station in central London. That was constructed, and the construction risk was taken out of the project, and then that line was put up for bid, and Canadian pension funds now own that line between St. Pancras and are taking all the risk on maintaining and owning and operating that line. And that's a fantastic opportunity for them because the infrastructure is in place, and they get a long-term rate of return, and they have a risk model that matches their expected rate of return. So there's definitely opportunities in the rail sector, and I think Vinayak spoke to those in India, but it's a sector that's ripe for PPPs.
Benedict, you had something.
Yeah, the bank is closely involved with the railways for financing the Eastern Dedicated Freight Corridor. So we happen to know a little bit about the railways in India. But we're very, very encouraged that the government took the step to open up the railways for FDI. That's just released, so that's a very important step. All the things you said is true. There are a lot of possibilities, but let's not forget there's on railway infrastructure itself there's a huge opportunity. We're doing the Eastern Dedicated Freight Corridor on a design-build basis. Why not design, build, operate, and maintenance? Go in that direction. That is possible. It has been done. It is being done elsewhere, and India is ideally suited for that. The concept is accepted. There's no discussion about that. It will bring in efficiencies. Of course, there is a political element to it. The railways are not used to it. They have to be sensitized. They have to be familiarized with the concept further. But we can do it. And if this government is really engaged and committed to go that direction, I think there is a lot of opportunities. So it will bring in extra financing, the risk allocation will be better, and the efficiencies will be there.
Suneet, can I?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Well, this is a good question, and I have some experience interacting with the Rail Bhavan quite frequently over a period of nearly 3 years without much of a success. Yes, Railway has been one of the most laggard in achieving the target of their PPPs, only 4% in the 11 5-year plan, which is nothing. And there is a tremendous resistance on Rail Bhavan to have an entry of the PPP structure there at all. Without touching upon the ongoing projects, which might be giving a feeling to the union and the political system that you are privatizing the public system altogether. What we can really target the new capacity building. A cluster of industries are coming in different places, which could be then linked with the new connectivity for both bringing in the inputs and taking the outputs to the destination from there by making all the stakeholders as a partner to it. And this is a proposal I have suggested for Orissa, where cluster of industries are coming, big industries, both national and international big players. And we really moved around for about 3 years interacting with them. Nobody is saying no, this is not something doable, but entry was very difficult. But this is something we need to encourage now that the government is coming in the forefront for getting railways into PPP model. This is a time that we should really interact more intensely with the government and the railway ministry to see that how this could be really made effective enough for bringing in private investment in a big way to develop the infrastructure that they need in the railway system.
Thanks. So one more last question, and I'd like to wrap up. I'm sure we can meet thereafter and have carried the discussion. Yeah. I see one hand up there. I committed. Okay, go ahead. That's the last one. I'm sorry.
Maybe. When I hear about railways, Rail Bhavan, it makes me happier because I've done some significant work there, and maybe 1 or 2 anecdotes which I can share with you later. I was being appointed the consultant for New Delhi station 91, 92 onward, but that's another story. From my experience, I have learned when I see from the drawing board to execution, we in India, what we lack is, we have a lot of inspection. But what I want to say is, people do not do what you expect, but people do what you inspect. So there lies the whole gamut of delivering quality goods or quality services or whatever. So I would just urge that being an architect, I analyze for you that an architect building may be good because he is passionate about it. Whereas when it comes to town planning or infrastructure, the passion somehow is lacking because he doesn't see his vision being translated. So I think if there could be a little bit of cross-thinking from both the sides, things would be much better. I repeat, people do not do what you expect, but people do what you inspect. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think with that, I'd like to wrap up. I think just a couple of points. I'm sure there are questions and some of us are there over the tea, so we could carry on our discussions there. But I think a couple of points that came across, and there was an interesting article by Swaminathan Ankleshwara here a few days back, and this is with respect to international investors. I think at a time when Indian investors are not, shall we, feeling secure, and they are not in a position or willing to commit more money, I would find it very difficult for us to be able to attract international investors. So I think there is currently a pain in India with Indian investors for a variety of reasons. And the faster, whether through this 3P India mechanism or some other mechanism, we are able to resolve the issue of renegotiation, the issue of payments, disputes, and settle them quickly, I think the pain that the industry might be facing and the crisis that the industry is facing can be handled. Nobody can predict that the market would go down, but the market went down, demand went down, and therefore a lot of these things are, and these are black swan events that Vinayak just talked about that you can't predict. You had a booming economy for 10 years and then suddenly you have a blip. It's very difficult to predict. Everybody in that 10-year period thought this is going to be upward cycle only, and everybody committed money on that basis. And are we going to fault the system? Sure, we are wiser in hindsight, we are all 6 by 6, but are we going to fault a system for wanting to develop India and being exuberant in trying to develop India? I think that would be unfortunate. I think the other aspect that I want to talk about, because we talked about railways, it's important that we take baby steps and make success over a few ones before we sort of go into the big ones, because I think something that you must appreciate, that India is what it is because of two fundamental things that we had from pre-independence, and that's the railways and Indian Post. That's one unifying architecture that made India what it is. Okay, and I think, so you should not tinker with something you're not sure. At a time when we can see a lot of pain in PPP around and things have not settled down, embarking whole hog in a large new sector, I would much rather advocate what Vinayak was talking about, carve out some areas and make success out of it, rather than go whole hog and then have a big backlash. So I think these are the 2 points that I would sort of underscore. I think the rest of the issues with respect to transparency and there is a lot of hope around this 3P India, saying that maybe the renegotiation and sanity coming back to PPP contracts would be a way to look at in the light of some of the discussions that have happened in the last couple of months on renegotiations, etc. I think bankers and the financing agencies also like to have an institution like 3P India, which is kind of arm's length from the government and arm's length from the private sector, which is in a position to kind of, I wouldn't say certify, but which is in a position to, if I may use another banking terminology, sort of credit enhance and say that the process has been followed, which is a due process, it's transparent. And I think that will give confidence to developers, it will give confidence to bankers, and I think it will give confidence to the people at large. And I think the last point which we have probably not debated upon as much is the point that Arun made, is involving people, whether it is during the course of the projects as you are implementing, or you do through a variety of methods like public hearing. But I think it's important that we do that, because that gives the infrastructure project a backing which is beyond just the political realm. It actually insulates it from all political risk that we bring about. I think with those points, if we could wrap that up, and we'll carry on the discussions over tea.
Thank you so very much, sir. Appreciate the session, and even though we are, in fact, in the last panel discussion of the day, we had a pretty engaging panel discussion there. I'd like to thank Mr. Maheshwari for moderating the session, and of course, all the panelists. May I request all of you to please join us for a group picture, and may I also take this opportunity of inviting on stage Mr. Rishi Kapoor from our team to thank each one of you. Please join us in the picture, Rishi. Thank you, gentlemen. And now a token of appreciation for each one of you for making this an engaging panel discussion, from drawing board to execution, bringing vision to reality through PPP. And we'd like to invite all of you to make sure that in case you'd like to take the discussions further on a one-to-one basis, our panelists, our moderator will be present here for tea. I'm sure they'll be more than happy to take your questions, share opinions and more. So another one, this time as a panelist. Earlier it was for a moderator. Thank you, gentlemen. What a pleasure it has been. Thank you, Rishi. Before I invite all of you to join us for tea, I'd once again like to remind all of you to please make sure that you fill in the feedback forms. Either submit them at the registration desk, or you can let them be at the tables. We'll make sure that we collect them. And as I once again thank each one of our partners, I'd like to invite all of you to join us for a networking tea and coffee break. Thank you once again for joining us in the Infra Focus Summit, the second annual summit. May I now invite all of you to join us for tea and coffee, please.